to me, it's pernicious. You don't have a definition, and you say a bunch of big flowery words with the intent to mislead people, because we already had a definition of racism, and that has existed several decades, at least in the United States.
Which is what we would agree with in terms of a biblical perspective, that God has created one human race. There's different ethnicities, different nationalities, and so forth, different languages, different cultures, but there's only one human race.
First Chronicles 12, verse 32. Of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do, 200 chiefs and all their kinsmen under their command. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the L.A.S.T podcast, where we look at and see through our culture from a biblical perspective. I'm your host, Julian Gibbs, with my co-host, Mike Matthews. This is the podcast where the woke comes to choke, the stupid comes to die. Welcome. Good morning, Mike.
Yeah, it's good to be with you once again, Julian, as always.
Yeah, so, the sons of Issachar, they understood the times and they knew what to do about them. And that's kind of like what we do here at the L.A.S.T podcast. We look at culture and what's happening around us, and we analyze it through the text of Scripture and from a biblical perspective to assist brothers and sisters in Christ on how they ought to respond to things. And also the folks who may not be believers understand why we think the way we think. We can represent our worldview to them, and so they don't have to try to misrepresent it to us.
Yeah. Just thinking how in order to tear down strongholds, like Paul tells us in the Corinthians, that we have to know what those strongholds are. So that's what this deals with as well, doesn't it?
Right.
Knowing what the enemy that we face in order to be able to tear down those strongholds.
So today we're going to be discussing the circus and the lesson that we've been given with what critical race theory, woke ideology, Marxist ideology, what that means to the church and how it's infiltrating the church, and how folks can, identify it and avoid it, and also properly respond to it in a Christ-like manner and in a biblical way. And so we're on, what's this, part 4?
I think it's about part 4. We've done the history.
Yep.
And we looked at a number of things there with Karl Marx, the Frankfurt School, the American universities. Now we're getting into, as it were, the guts of the circus of what is it? What is critical race theory? What is wokeism? What is social justice? So we're getting into the innards here with this podcast. Yeah,
so now we're getting into the critical race theory part, and in order to understand critical race theory, you have to understand what it is to be racist, what is race, and all of that stuff. And so let's first talk about and define what the proponents of critical race theory would say about racism. Let's define racism first. So the first place I went to a bunch of different places to find a definition for racism. And you can tell that even the internet and institutions where the common definition of racism is no longer what it used to be, it's changed, and they start using examples of racism, basically the same tropes and presuppositions from the folks who we would consider woke. I did find a definition that seemed to be neutral from the Britannica.com, and we'll put the link in the description for those who want to see it. And this is how they define racism. Racism, the belief that humans may be divided into separate and exclusive biological entities called races, quote unquote. That is, there is a causal link between inherited physical traits and traits of personality, intellect, morality, and other cultural and behavioral features, and that some races are innately superior to others. The term is also applied to political, economic, or legal institutions and systems that engage in or perpetuate discrimination on the basis of race or otherwise reinforce racial inequalities in wealth and income, education, healthcare, civil rights, and other such areas. Such institutional, structural, or systematic racism became a particular focus of scholarly investigation in the 1980s with the emergence of critical race theory, an offshoot of the critical legal studies movement. Since the late 20th century, the notion of biological race has been recognized as a cultural invention entirely without scientific basis. What do you think about that definition?
I think it's a good summation. I would probably zero in on one aspect. If I wanted to boil that down, I mean, if I read this over to a number of folks, or if you read it over to me like this did and asked me to repeat it, I might get a little lost. But zeroing in on one particular sentence there, that racism is a view, it's a term that sees one particular group of people as inherently superior to another group. I think that sums it up in terms of what racism is. Then they get into the other, which is that it's culturally derived as opposed to anything scientific behind it. Mm-hmm. Which is what we would agree with in terms of a biblical perspective, that God has created one human race. There's different ethnicities, different nationalities, and so forth, different languages, different cultures, but there's only one human race. Within that one human race, there has been, and there probably always will be, certain ethnic groups that feel they're superior to others. Mm-hmm. In other words, and it usually has to do with my race is superior to your race, and your race is superior to my race.
Yeah, I would say that this particular definition also doesn't go far enough to address the biblical issue that we just spoke about. Because thinking of anybody as beneath you or less of a human than you is a sin called hatred. And so racism is a fancy word for hatred. And if you think that I'm without sin, scripture says you're a liar and the truth isn't in you. And if you're not looking at and you're not loving your brother as you love yourself, that's a sin and a biblical issue. And so, yeah, this is like a nice secular definition for what racism is. But from the biblical perspective, we should always look at, hey, do I hate my brother? Is my belief that my culture or my ethnicity or what have you is superior to theirs? Is that coming from a place of a biblical presupposition or not?
Yeah, I would add to hatred towards another person, pride towards oneself, as the who was that? As many of anthropologists have discovered when they study other culture groups and the language of those groups, that many times the word that people have that describes themselves, like if you ask somebody who's born and raised 100 years ago in Greenland, spoke the language, and you say, what's the name you have for yourself, the name that you have for yourself? It's often a word that means we are the people. Of all the people on earth, we are the people. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, gives a perspective of how racism, or a feeling of superiority, is somewhat inbred into the human nature as a result of the fall. That my ethnicity is better than your ethnicity. Why? Because I'm me.
Right. Interesting. So this is how we just went through a definition of what a scholarly portion. I want to go back to this real quick. The section in the definition which says where it became a particular focus of scholarly investigation in the 1980s. I'm not too sure where I'm going to disagree with the fact that with that statement. I don't think that critical race theory or an intersectionality and those things that were born out of the postmodernist or the post-postmodernist ideology, especially with respect to Marxism and neo-Marxism, I don't really put too much scholastic respect on that research or those studies. We call that, I think you would call that anthropology. the study, and so I mean sociology is okay, but I think anthropology is what you would call it, and critical race theory or the study of systematic racism doesn't necessarily, to me, it just isn't very, isn't, I wouldn't call that very scholarly.
Yeah. I think the lady who came up with the term was Kimberly Crenshaw at a conference that they had in Wisconsin, I believe it was, in 1980s. And probably the reason they call it scholarly is because she did happen to have a number of initials after her name, as well as did Derek Bell, her the one who mentored her when she was going to university, who was the father of critical legal studies. Scholarly, I guess, in the sense that they have those doctor initials after their name, which I guess gives them the inherent right to anything that they produce or say then is, quote, scholarly, whether it is or not. Huh?
Yeah, the words, like, to me, words matter and words have meaning. And so whenever I'm looking at listening to someone say, well, studies show this and studies show that, brothers and sisters, we know that we can probably go scour the internet or whatever and find studies that will affirm our biases and our presuppositions and what we think already. But, true scholarship means that and can understand the hypothesis, the thesis, and the way they set up the test. Is it blind, double blind? Yeah. What are the independent variables that they ignored or they put in to skew the study the way they wanted to come out? And you would look at all of them and see if that's something that is in the whole of society in the way everybody thinks. And that's not what happened.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to do any research and scholarship based off the disparities that you see within a culture, based off how much somebody has versus how much somebody else doesn't have, that's not particularly scholarly. That's starting from a place of covetousness. And for me, I outright reject it. If you're going to do a study, to me, like if you're going to do a study on different ethnicities and how they, how they would both flourish within a certain sort of community or society, everybody would have to start from the beginning, right? Both would have to have a set of parents, decent parents who believe in the same ethos. And then you would place those kids in the same educational system, and put the same ethos on, and then see what independently, since they're all individuals, they're going to make different decisions and do different things based off whatever you give them and their intelligence level, skill set, and all that. But how they succeed, you'd have to place them both in the exact same job for the exact same amount of time and see who produces the most. But if one group of people are going over here to be doctors and the other group of people are coming over here to be engineers, and the market, let's say like everybody gets sick, then there's a market for the doctor to flourish versus the engineer. And so the outcomes there'd be disparate outcomes. And you won't be able to say this group of people failed, the engineer group of people failed because they were black or because they were white. It's because the market pushed for medicine at the time, or vice versa. And so I don't see any of that. Whenever you're looking at any of their studies, you never see any of those things. What you do see is, like in the black community, you will see like there's like 70% of the households don't have a father. You will see crime. High rates of crime, high rates of sexual promiscuity, and a perpetual cycle of single motherhood, boys being raised without fathers, going through the public school system and usually in the inner city with poor teachers, poor education, high crime, violence, and the things that we consume that I would say the things that we consume that whites don't force you to consume. like hip hop or gangster rap and the language and the clothing and what have you, those sorts of things aren't even considered as major reasons for why you have a disparate outcome, because the way you think and what's in your mind is going to, as Christ says, is going to manifest in what you do. So Jesus says that that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and out of the good treasure you have stored up in your heart is why you do good, and the bad treasure that you have stored up in your heart is why you do badly, right? And so listening to Jesus as to why people do the things they do, or you can look at what Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, and Ibram X. Kendi, and all of the other woke scolds, right? What they say, and see and compare who's probably telling you the truth. Is it Jesus or is it them? I can't blame the fact that, like I'm a single, like if you're a single mother and you have, like 8 kids with 5 baby daddies, that's probably your fault, not the white guy's fault. If you're Latino, or you come from Central or South America and you want to move into the United States to escape the poverty that's in your state, maybe it has something to do with your culture. If your culture is dominated by drug cartels and large gangs, maybe it has something to do with that and the unwillingness or the inability to overthrow or to put off the wickedness that's in control of your society. Maybe that has something to do with it, not that the white guy somewhere like thousands of miles away is keeping you down. That's just a thought. But let's just see what Ibram X. Kendi, how he defines racism.
And just who is this guy that you're?
Ibram X. Kendi is he also has a bunch of letters behind his name.
Yes, he does.
And he is I guess I wouldn't say the father of it, but he's the progenitor. He is the major proponent of the anti-racist movement, which means not what you think. It's not I'm against what we just read the definition of the thing here. Is that I am against Western culture, and whites have benefited from Western culture more than anybody else. And so therefore, in order to prove that you're not with the definition that we just read here, or biblically, the biblical definition of racism, you have to give me your stuff.
Yeah. He's a very well-known man, isn't he?
Yep.
Yeah. Teaches at the Boston University. What does he have? How does he define racism?
Let's see, because I got it right here.
You do?
You talked about the importance of defining racism. How do you define racism?
Sure. So racism, I would define it as a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. Sure. A collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. And anti-racism is pretty simple, using the same terms. Anti-racism is a collection of anti-racist policies leading to racial, anybody want to take a guess? Equity that are substantiated by anti-racist ideas.
What?
That's a good response. What? And that was the response of the audience, wasn't it? I mean, there was silence, but everybody sat there thinking, what did that guy just say? I think he used the term that he was trying to define 3 times in the definition.
Yeah, it's very pernicious. Actually, the correction, I think we said that he was a professor at Washington, but I think at this time when he gave this, he was a professor at Boston University. Yeah, but to me, it's pernicious. You don't have a definition, and you say a bunch of big flowery words with the intent to mislead people. because we already had a definition of racism, and that has existed several decades at least in the United States, right? We knew what racism was. If you had asked someone what racism was prior to the Civil Rights Movement, in the United States, like say the 1950s, the definition would be a whole lot clearer, right?
Yep.
If we asked, when I was growing up, going to school through the 80s, and I graduated in the 90s from high school, just going through the public schools, racism was pretty straightforward. It was anybody of a race who hates another race or thinks they're superior to another race, or that one race has traits that are inferior. You know, just kind of like how the Britannica.com did, but it was just simple. Maybe 1 or 2 lines. When you called somebody a racist, the implication was you hate me because of the color of my skin, or I hate you because of the color of your skin. I think I'm better than you. Easy. It was none of this fancy about it. Was the conversation of equity never came up. It was treat me like a human being. Now it's treat me like I'm a human being, and give me all your stuff. and I would say also that if you're in a coming from a mindset or from a generation that was taught that everybody gets a trophy and that your contribution, whatever it is just as important as the guy next to you, no matter how little you put in, well then equity would probably be your goal. I want a trophy too.
Yeah, you see how ridiculous that is if you carry it to its nth degree, that everybody has to win the race. Everybody crosses the finish line at the same time, and that sort of thing. Everybody jumps the same height if we put it over into the physical realm, those kinds of things. Everybody gets a prize. Everybody gets a star by their name.
Do you ever remember like like every once in a while they'll put out a feel-good video? And they used to have these people who would run marathons for whatever causes they were running. And there would always be like, and every once in a while there would be someone who was struggling on the way to, just to quit the marathon. But everybody would stay behind and cheer them on. And, like people are leaving, the sun is going down, except for the folks who like running the race and some supporters and things of that nature. And that person would cross the finish line dead last, hours behind, if not more behind somebody, right? And everybody would cheer and they crossed the line and they could go home and they could be like, hey, I put in the work, I practiced hard. I didn't finish first and I came in not even in the middle of the pack. I came in dead last. And I remember there was a lady, she crossed over the line on her hands and knees. That's all she had left. But nobody placed her on the podium next to the guy who finished first. That guy was done hours before. He was better. It's okay to say that. And I think as Christians, we added to the commandments like thou shalt be nice and you shalt not hurt my feelings. Those aren't commandments in the text in the God's law. And we go out of our way. I think we go out of our way to not offend folks, and it's real easy to manipulate a Christian into thinking that there's nothing wrong with trying to attain equity when God is not interested in equity, never was, and He's not even interested in. It's going to sound weird. It's going to sound controversial. He's not even interested in equality and never was. He was always been interested in righteousness, holiness, and doing things for His glory. And He will pick and choose whomever He wants to fulfill His decrees. And that's us. This human beings are the ones who are placing all of this merit on different things and lionizing people and what have you. I'm like, hey, you want to be the best garbage guy? Fine, be the best garbage guy. God doesn't care about the best garbage guy any more than he cares about who the best president of the United States was. And he doesn't care about which ethnic group is flourishing or making the most money versus who's the poorest. What God cares about is who's glorifying him, who's following the law, who's sharing the gospel, who's making disciples for Christ, who's living righteously and holy. Because if we look at the book of Revelation, and the John, when in his revelation, he says that he saw all those great and small come before the throne of God. Everybody was on their knees equally. I mean, talk about equity. Everybody's going to be equally and equitably on their face, proclaiming that Christ is Lord. So, and then he's going to give you your reward based off what you have done. If you are not in Christ, which isn't much, you can be like, hey, I'm Abram X. Kendi, and I wrote a book about anti-racism. What's that going to mean to Christ? But let's get into some definitions and some relationships. And I'm going to let you talk about it, because I think I've talked enough.
Okay, well, just coming off of Ibram Kendi's definition there, which was not an actual definition, nor was it a very, therefore it wasn't a good definition, not one that you would then go out on the street and say to somebody if you were talking about racism, well, here's a good, clear definition. He didn't give that. And I think, as you intimated, that might be on purpose in order just to keep the useful idiots in their place. So what we wanted to do and tried to do in the book, The Circus, is to come up with definitions that were clear, that were accurate, and that were simple, and to show the relationships between critical race theory, wokeism, and social justice. Because most of the books on these subjects, many of them good books, but they don't, at least I haven't found one that talks about how these are all related, these different aspects of what we're talking about, critical race theory, wokeism, social justice, how they're intricately related with each other. So what the book, The Circus, did, what we tried to do in that book, is to come up with definitions and relationship that is understandable and accurate. I'm not saying it's the only way to see these things, but I think it's a way that is accurate and will help you to remember it as it is. So that's what this slide is here. Very simply, where critical race theory is the ideology. It's the set of ideas that are behind all of this way of thinking. Wokeism is the awareness is becoming awoke, wakened, alive, risen from the dead, as it were, and being aware of what's going on concerning critical race theory. It's the awareness aspect. And social justice, and actually in the book I changed the title of that to social revenge, because I think it's not, it's social, but it's definitely not justice. It's social revenge. That's the goal. That's what we're going after. So critical race theory is an ideology. It's an aggressive ideology, as we will talk about a bit later as well. It's not, it doesn't have a defense team. It only has an offense team, and it's on the offense, very aggressive. Wokeism is an acute, a very much alive awareness that results in action, as we'll see as we talk about it later on as well. And social justice, social revenge is the audacious goal. It's a very big goal that they're after in terms of reparations and turning the world upside down. So at least from the helicopter, maybe even a little bit higher than that, from the 30,000 foot level, here's the three things that we're going to be looking at as we look at the guts of the circus. Critical race theory, That's the ideology, the way of thinking behind it that comes from the Marx history. Wokeism is the awareness and the action that goes with that. And social revenge is the goal. This is what we're after. So those, in a nutshell, that's what we're going to be looking at. And we'll get into the weeds. Now we'll come down from the 30,000 foot level and get at least in a small plane where we're just kind of cruising.
Yeah, I like that. I like all those descriptions, especially like the woke, the woke definition that you gave it, because as Christians, we are, prior to us becoming believers and being saved by Christ, we're told that we are dead in our trespasses, slaves to our sins, and that our master is the devil. We're also described as sleep and blind. Yet people who don't know Christ are claiming to be awakened. It's kind of, to me, it's kind of like a repetition of the quote unquote Enlightenment movement. We're in the dark age, and then the age of enlightenment comes along, and the age of enlightenment has a component to it where it's a rejection of biblical thought, and biblical thinking is placed into the camp of superstition and quote unquote science. Absent of a biblical worldview is going to be the goal, right? And the place to where you want to be. And so I think there's a repetition of that, you know, like with the quote unquote, when the woke stuff started happening. And I remember first hearing the term back in the early to mid 2000s, around, I want to say it was around the second term of Barack Obama. Folks started claiming to be woke. Mm-hmm. And the wokeness is like there are white liberals, mostly college educated women, who are now aware of their unconscious biases. I started hearing that a lot. I'm like, how can you be subconscious or have an unconscious bias, or like those are active, like you have to actively hate somebody. You can't passively hate people, or you can't passively have a negative feeling about somebody or a group of people that you haven't met or that have any interaction with and don't know anything about. That doesn't make any sense. So there's also like a tinge of Gnosticism there.
Yeah.
Like how do you know this? And so that's what I called it. I called it academic Gnosticism. Like, how do you know that? If you watch like a group of YouTubers and stuff now, and folks on social media, they just know, or they Googled it. But like we were talking earlier, that's not research and that's not scholarship. You don't actually know anything about the subject matter, but you know it. It's a spiritual knowing, which is the point I'm getting at. It's a supernatural knowing. And to me, that's demonic, which is why I have such a huge animus towards it. And because as Christians, we only know what we know, all the knowledge, because the Bible claims that all knowledge and wisdom comes from God. And that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, not Ibram X. Kendi writing a book about anti-racism. And the definitions must necessarily change if you're on that side. You have to actively change the definitions from the original meaning of the word and how God defined the words and how godly men define the words in order to advance your nonsense. And with social justice, God just talks about the word justice. There's no qualifier there. It's an inherent thing, kind of like truth, right? Either it's true or it's not. And either something is just or it's not. There's no such thing in the world as something that's just, that's socially just, but is just normally unjust. I can't think of one thing. And the moment you put a qualifier in front of that word of justice, it's no longer justice, because justice is the restoration of good over evil.
Well, I think you've landed on something there, because the critical race theorists, the wokeists, and the social revenge people, one of the things that they do very well is in the use and the misuse of language. And as you've said, of giving definitions to things that may or may not be true, and of being willing to change those definitions on a dime if they seem to lose their power or they lose their purpose. Then we'll just change the definition so that truth means something different than what we normally think of it is. Racism is something different than we normally think it is. Theory is something different than we normally think it is. So they're all about language, and I believe that they're very good at what they're doing there in terms of playing with the language, using the language to create a particular narrative in order to change the way people are thinking. They're experts at that.
Well, I think the reason that they get away with it is because, they control the media, and they also control the universities, like we spoke about before. So if anybody can get on stage and say a bunch of stupid stuff, right? And
evidently,
right, and nobody's going to believe him, right? We're like, oh, that guy's an idiot, right? He's a comedian, or he's an actor, he's an actress. Stupid. But if you can get a bunch of professors with letters behind their name to affirm the nonsense that you're saying, then all of a sudden people start thinking it's true. Like you can look at folks coming in front of Congress to testify about whatever, and they're professors. They've got letters behind their name. They even have medical doctors. This is a hard science, who don't know the difference between men and women, and they don't like using those words. They'll even tell you, we don't like using those words. And when you ask them to define, like Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire, when he had his documentary called "What Is a Woman," and he would ask these supposedly educated people, "What is a woman?" Their response would be, "A woman is a person who identifies themselves as a woman." It's the same game that Ibram X. Kendi used. You use the words to define the thing, but we all know that a woman is an adult human female with 2 X chromosomes, right? And a male is the opposite, is an adult human male with a Y X chromosome. And it was that simple, but now it's complicated. And that's why you have to have a bajillion different genders. You have to, when you're talking about quote unquote race and ethnicities, all black people think a certain way. That's racist. That's hateful. Why do you think that? We're not a monolith. If you watch some of the guys, well, there's like certain, I guess they'll be on the right-wing activists who will go around and interview random kids at universities. And they will ask white people, I would say, or mostly young white girls and a couple white guys, but mostly young white liberal women, about the conditions that black people live in. These people actually think that we don't have driver's licenses, have no access to them. We can't go to hospitals. We have no access to health care. You don't have any food. It's mind-boggling that they actually think this, and they've been fed this narrative. They've been fed a truly hateful narrative in order to push their agenda, make themselves feel good, and they're considered woke. And they'll also, like the same interview, would go into like a black neighborhood in the middle of the inner city and show them what the people think about them. And they're like, I can't believe these people who are supposedly our allies think this about us. They think so low of us. I've got not only do I have an ID, I've got several IDs. I've voted in every election. I've got transportation. I've got a house. I've got 401k. I've got the same stuff. So it's that's why I say it's pernicious, because if you've got a PhD and all that stuff behind your name, you know better.
Well, I can't help but think of Romans chapter 2 and all of this, where we are talking about, and well, even pardon the language, but where people are literally fools in their way of thinking. And why is that? Why is that? Why can people think this way that is so contrary to reasoning, to logic, to reality? But if people if we as a society and as a culture have turned our backs on God, I'm not talking about the church at this point, but as a nation, as a society, and as a culture that in the last 50 years have, I was going to say slowly but surely, but maybe not so slowly, let's say at least surely, turned our backs on God, even as the Enlightenment said, God, you exist, but you were putting you out to pasture. We don't need you anymore. We're going with reason. Now we've taken that even a step further. We don't even need reason. All we need is our experience. And that will tell, at least the experience of some groups, that will tell us if what is true or not. So you've got people turning their backs on God long enough to where, as it says in Romans chapter 2, that he turned them over to themselves, as it were, to where, and I think that's an indication of that we are past the tipping point as a nation when it comes to this whole circus concept. Can we be redeemed as a nation? All things are possible. But I'll just say it here publicly. I think it's unlikely because of our turning our backs on God, that he has now, as he does with every nation, at least in history so far that has done that, he says, okay, then go your way. Go your way. I'm done. Hands off. Have at it. And let's see where it takes you.
I agree. I being turned over to a reprobate mind and being delusional means that unless that delusion is broken, you're going to be stuck there. And I'm inclined to agree with you that can we be redeemed? Absolutely. But I think it's also unlikely because the remedy that people are using to combat the wokeness is, number one, they either try to appease as much as they possibly can before they cross a line, or they try to do it with like something political, and which to me is not the remedy that's going to last. It's going to have the most lasting effect.
Absolutely. That's where I think the church is going to have to be woke. I use it sarcastically. Yes. It's going to have to be wise in this because as I think we'll talk later on, where some churches want to use critical race theory as a tool to help them to understand other people. We have to understand that the answer to all of this that's going on in our nation, this particular thing that's going on, is not to come alongside them and try to see, okay, what good do you have? And let's see if we can't have some symbiosis here. The answer to this is going to be pretty simple. The answer to this foolishness is going to be the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, presented clearly, plainly, simply, and the power of God going with that will change hearts and minds. That's the answer to this, as opposed to, even trying to argue with them, as it were. It's to understand them and then to go after the pillars that are supporting them, which are inconsistent with reality, and show that what you guys are thinking, it doesn't work. It won't work. It will only take you further down the path of hell. The answer is the gospel. The answer is what Jesus Christ has done. The answer is in the biblical story. And are being, as believers, being true to that, faithful to that in terms of what our message is, so that we don't get caught up with some of this thinking in terms of reparations, and that we need to help people that we think are lower than us. Well, we'll help them by giving them things.
Yeah. So tell us about the five fun. You've broken down that critical race theory has about 5 fundamentals, and you call it the heroes, not commonly spelled heroes, but the HEROS heroes. Let's break that down. Tell us what that's all about.
Sure. Again, trying to get to the concept of simplicity, and yet being objectively correct and sufficient. That critical race theory has these 5 fundamental things. So if we can remember that these are the 5 fundamentals of critical race theory, then we will be able to have a decent, accurate conversation with people, probably mostly trying to help them to see what some definitions are. But it is these 5 things that you've noticed, even though I did misspell heroes, because there should be an E between the O and the S, but there's not 6 fundamentals, there's 5. So it has to do with history, and we'll talk about each one of these as we go along. Critical race theory deals with history, with experience, racism, oppression, and societal construction. Now, today we'll probably just get to the history one, as we're going to get down into it. Not spend a lot of time on each one, but enough to give an idea that, critical race theory, this is what they're up to, and this is where it comes from. That first one is history. And it's I was going to say it's a big one. They're all big ones. That's why they're the fundamentals. So there probably isn't one bigger than the other. These aren't in like descending order of power or importance. History is foundational because, and that the next slide gives of that the idea of critical race theory is that we need to rewrite history. Why? For the Western world, America, the United States particularly. Why? Because the history that has been written is not the correct history. The events are not they might say that the events happened, but they're not the important events. Mm-hmm. Christopher Columbus coming over on a boat named the Santa Maria, that's not a big deal. The big deal is something else, and you guys have left that out. Mm-hmm. The characters have to be changed. The setting has to be changed. The dates have to be changed. There we see that key events have to be changed. Memorials, symbols have to be changed. Celebration holidays have to be changed. Everything that has to do that reminds people of the history as it has been written in our history books 50 years ago, that has to be redone. Why? Because if you change the story people live in, mm-hmm. then you'll change the way they're thinking. And that's what we, critical race theorists, are about. We want to change the way people think, therefore change the way the people act. In order to change the way people think, you change the story in which they're living. And that's what they're out to do. We could have examples on each one of them. Heroes have to be changed. Our hero is not George Washington. Come mm-hmm. on. It's Jim Crow. Our hero is not Christopher Columbus. It's not any of those guys that we used to have on our calendars as George Washington Day, mm-hmm. Abraham Lincoln Day. No, all of that has to be changed.
Let me interrupt real quick. So, when I was in law enforcement and we had to take a report, we're just reporting just the facts. And we would try to go out and get the who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's it. At approximately such and such a time, dispatch or whatever received a call from so-and-so stating X. And at this time, Officer Gibbs was dispatched to such and such. At this time, that Officer Gibbs arrived on scene at blah, 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 blah. I met with so-and-so stated this. And that's all I would do is write that down, right? Take their information down. Sometimes I would ask for those questions in that order to keep so that the report would be coherent. And then I would go and look for evidence. If it was somebody was reporting a crime or whatever, I would go and try to look for evidence that supported what they were saying, talk to other people, witnesses, whatever. Turn that all in, done. It's out of my hands, and let the prosecutor or whoever, the court, deal with that stuff. And that would be the end of it. But today, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, which would be the history, is not is not what's in there. They've added some other stuff. It's the who, what, when, where, why, how, and feel.
Yeah, they were getting into what's the difference between story and narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you can Google this and you get a lot of different definitions in that as well, and how they are sometimes interchangeable and sort. But as a general rule, those who are into sort of the scholastic part of story and narrative would say that story is the actual events that happened and the order of those events, the sequence of those events. That's the story. Narrative is the interpretation of those events. So narrative has a interpretive. It has a this is my take on what happened, and what we're talking about is that that the critical race theorists want to give their interpretation of the events that actually happened.
Right.
Now they would say that no, wait a second, wait, hold your horses there. We're saying that you have your events, you have your characters, you have your setting, your plot. All we're saying is you got all that wrong. You got the wrong characters. We have the right characters. You have the wrong events. We have the right events. It's not 1492. It's 1619. That's what they would say in a debate on that.
Right. Yeah. So let's say historically, slavery is evil. Is not necessarily not evil. Let's just say historically, slavery is allowed.
Historic, as in world history.
As a world history, right? Tolerated, practiced by every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every creed. With respect to African slavery, slaves are captured and traded and sold from African to African, African to Arab, and so on and so forth. However far you can get out is how slaves are traded. There's a transatlantic slave trade because those people are going west and going to Europe and going west to the colonies. And then there's also a trans-Saharan slave trade where Africans are being pushed toward the east through the Middle East and the Far East and all the way up as far as, Iran, Iraq, and just all over the Middle East, right? Or Eurasia, let's just call it that. And more people, more blacks are sold and traded and transferred across these nations for a longer period of time, still to this day, than what was the transatlantic slave trade. But because we're going to eliminate all of that, because that would implicate everybody, all people of color, in practicing something that is considered evil today. Now, I considered it evil 100% of the time, all the time, right? From the beginning of time till whenever. Slavery is bad. Slavery is evil. But it's not evil when my people do it. It's evil when your people do it. And so I'm going to eliminate that part of the story and only talk about white guys showing up on the shores of Africa with ships and bringing people over to the United States in 1619. That makes absolutely zero sense.
Well, that's a classic illustration of narrative. Not only you choose what you will say, and you choose what you will not say. Absolutely, in order to make up a particular story that you want the listeners to hear and to believe.
Yeah, I used to work with folks on the East when I lived on the East Coast, and I would work with different folks, and we're all from New York or whatever. And there's like groups of Black Muslims, and there's a group of the Black Hebrew Israelites, and all sorts of different religions working together. And we're majority Black at the at this job. And we would talk about, and slavery would come out as an excuse, like we're doing now, people picking up the woke stuff. And I would bring this point up. And the response I would get was, well, slavery in Africa wasn't as bad as a slavery in the United States? Like who? And my response would be like, did you ask the slave? I wouldn't want to be a slave in anybody's, of anyone, black, white, or whatever. That's like saying, hey, when I robbed you nicer than the other guy. The other guy beat you up and held you at gunpoint. I only used a rock or a stick. It doesn't make any. Either it's evil and you hate the institution, or it's okay and you like the institution. When we're talking about morality, there's very rare cases where there's degrees of morality. And as a Christian and as a Bible believer, if you sinned in your heart, then you're guilty of the sin. And Christ says if you break one part of the law, you've broken it all. And so therefore, we don't make excuses and carve-outs like the woke people do. So if you are truly awake and you're truly enlightened and you're truly aware and alive, that you have, and it's this acute awareness of all of the quote unquote injustice, then everybody who is unjust would earn your ire, would earn your wrath, right? Like Batman doesn't pick and choose which bad guys he goes after. He goes after the pickpocket just like he goes after the Joker, right? But the wokes, they're like, I'm only going to fight against the Joker. All the other crimes you're free to do. That's not a hero, right?
No.
Right?
No, not a hero.
And the history, we were talking about this earlier, and you were saying like the history is, you said it's a particular experience that's fundamental.
Yeah, the idea is that it's not, well, particularism, if we think of it even in terms of the religious institution, has to do with if a group of people are particularistic in the religion, then they believe that religion is for them, but it's not for you. It's for our people, and it doesn't apply to your people. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about particularism. So here, when we talk about history, or when we talk the next one about experience, we're talking about that we're using the term in that regard of particularism, that this is true for my people, but it's not true for your people. So when it comes to history, they would be saying, and here's where they go back and forth. They would be saying this history that we're bringing forth, it's for all of us. But when we get to the next one, when we talk about experience, and that experience trumps objective reality, then they're saying that no, our experience as the oppressed ones has greater power, greater influence, greater validity than your experience as the oppressors. Ours counts more. In fact, yours really doesn't count for anything. It's our experience that is particularistic. It's for us, and it defines objective truth.
You notice, I don't know if you've watched any of the debates and arguments. This will be an argument. This is a major argument, right? It will say you can't deny or minimize people's lived experiences. Now, in a debate or in logical argumentation, this would be known as a fallacy of anecdotal evidence. Your experiences are not authoritative. They could be true to you, but they're not typical. And so what you will see what the woke do, and the folk and proponents of critical race theory, or you want to insert the LGBTQ argument, it's my lived experience trumps objective reality. You can't assign moral agency to me or force me to be consistent across the board, because this is how I've lived, and this is how my life has been. So if you're black and you grew up in an inner city and you're poor and you have, I guess you're underemployed or just sufficiently employed, but you're not thriving like the whites, it's because you're discounting the lived experience of blacks in America. So when we say there's racism and people holding us down, it exists because I've experienced it. But when you ask them for a quantitative measure of why they are in the position that they're in, and start getting into those, and you start diving into those experiences and peeling those layers back by asking them, what choices did you make prior to your complaint? You're racist. And that's why, to me, this is why it's pernicious. And this is why it's evil. Because if you want to be a really good let's say like a really good basketball player, and you never practice any drills, you never show up you never play any games, or you play sporadically, but you want to receive a trophy, like when the champions win, when they're getting their trophies and stuff like that. Well, you can't claim that the people are being racist. You wouldn't claim that the people are being racist towards you because you didn't get a trophy. And you're not going to start talking about your lived experiences, about how you had a headache and you had an ankle problem that day and your back hurt and you couldn't make it. You couldn't get a ride, to practice and all that kind of stuff, right? Nobody's going to care. It's the same concept applies to like how things happen in your life. If you are doing bad things or you're doing poorly, Christ said it's because you do. It's out of the abundance of your heart is why you do the bad things. It's why you made the bad choices. If you do well, or you're doing good, what God Christ calls good, like we're talking about morality and stuff, right? It's because you have a good moral heart, probably because Christ lives there. And you're not looking at provision or abundance as the measurement of how well you're doing or thriving in society, because everybody earns differently, right? That's kind of why I also don't like the talking of class or the quote unquote class system, that we talk about, middle class, lower class. Like when you start out, everybody starts out poor, right? My parents don't have money. No, I don't have money. My parents have money, right? And if my parents are poor, I'm not poor. I was born poor, right? We just don't have stuff. We have less provision than the other guy. But at some point, you have to take responsibility for yourself and your actions and your thoughts and your deeds, and base that and use that to get out of your situation and make good, and based off of those decisions, you're going to be rewarded on those. So I was just talking about myself, like personally, when I got out of high school, I started doing some college. I joined the military, served in the military for a little while. And at the time when I first started in the military, I started as an aviation electronics tech, right? And then I didn't want to do that anymore. And so I chose to go into anti-terrorism, force protection, and law enforcement. And then when I got out of that, there were no jobs open for me in my fields or that I was certified in. So I applied for a job on the railroad as a railroad cop. And I was offered a job as a train conductor. And so I took that job. And I made more money than I would have had I been in those other jobs. And then then later on, because of my own genetics, I had to medically retire at the age of 40. At no point in this particular story or voyage did I run into white people doing things to me. It was just the results of the decisions I made and the work that I did. And then it didn't matter at the end of the day. It didn't matter because you're only going to be able to do what your talents or your body allows you to do. And I'm a little guy, right? And so since I'm a small guy, I was never going to be in the NFL, right? I was never going to be a WWF wrestler. I was never going to be in the NBA or any of those things. Nobody kept me down out of that stuff. I could have done anything, but I did what I wanted. I could have been a doctor if I wanted to be a doctor. It wasn't because nobody didn't want me to be. I got doctors and nurses in my family. Most of them are in the medical field or in the clergy. I chose to do what I wanted to do. and I did my job, and I got paid, and I advanced. And when I didn't want to do that anymore, or when I got tired or disenchanted, I went someplace else. And now I'm retired. And it is what it is. Nobody's doing anything to me. And so I think folks, like if you're a Christian, not only do you have to take accountability and responsibility for yourself and the decisions that you've made in life, and be willing to deal with the consequences of those decisions that you made in life. You also have to place accountability on other folks as well, on everyone else as well, and say, hey, if you do good, didn't God tell that to Cain? If you do well, won't you be rewarded for the good that you do? And if you do poorly, that's why you get poor results. That's God's order. You cannot have a group of people or tribes of people or entire cultures that are acting in straight up countervention to what God teaches, what God commands, and are going against his order for how he wants his universe to work, and think you're going to flourish. I was having a conversation with a dear sister, and I was telling her, that some cultures are better than others. Better in the sense that they're more moral, they are closer to God because they're in service of God and glory and his glory, and the other folks are not. So if you want those folks to do better, then you need to share the gospel and make disciples of them and bring them into the fold of Christ, right? Not give them aid and comfort by shipping them, cases of food and all that stuff. The reason that they can't grow and flourish in God's world is because this is God's world and they're anti-God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Am I being too, you think I'm being too pugnacious, or I don't think I'm being pugnacious, but do you think I'm being a little bit too harsh?
Not on this point.
Okay.
And if you do on another point, I'll let you know.
Okay. Well. All right. Well, it's going a little long. You get the last word.
Maybe we'll end with kind of where we started, where we talked about those sons of Issachar. They understood the times, and they knew what to do about it. The reason why we're even talking about the circus is because it's going on in our nation. Mm-hmm. It's going on big time. It's like a Trojan horse that has come upon us. And we want to understand it. We want to understand the stronghold that it has, the pillars that it has, the foundation, the thinking of it. Why? So that we can tear those down in hopefully polite conversations with people on the street and replace that with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's what we're doing. We're doing this. We don't want to just understand this. We want to understand it so that we can be better prepared to clearly present the gospel in this particular context, so that people will have ears to hear, and hopefully they will understand, and that God can use that to bring people to himself. That's why we're doing this, isn't it, Julian?
That's right. And if you find this helpful, please hit that like, share, and subscribe button. Leave us something in the comment section if you agree with us, or if there's a portion that you think that we need to cover that we haven't covered. We want to hear that as well, and hopefully it all helps for the glory of God. And with that, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us and sticking with us this long. We're going to finish this particular portion of CRT, hopefully on the next episode, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And thanks for joining the last podcast. Hope to see you again soon.